I should have left when the music started making my teeth ache. The bass thrummed through the floorboards of the old Victorian house, vibrating up through my chest, and I pressed myself harder against the peeling wallpaper, clutching a red Solo cup filled with something that tasted like regret and artificial cherry. The party swelled around me like a living thing, all sharp elbows and sudden laughter, conversations that bloomed and died in the space of seconds. I had come because Maya insisted. She said I needed to get out of my head, out of my apartment, out of the careful routines I had built around myself like armor. But standing there in the dim glow of Christmas lights strung haphazardly across the ceiling, I felt more trapped than I had in weeks. The air was thick with the smell of spilled beer and too many bodies pressed into too small a space. Every few minutes, someone would bump into me, mumble an apology without looking at my face, and drift away into the crowd. This was how I moved through the world, I realized, like furniture that people navigated around without really seeing, like background noise in their louder, brighter lives. I had perfected the art of taking up just enough space to exist, but not enough to matter. My jacket, a charcoal wool coat my grandmother had given me the winter before she died, hung over the back of a folding chair beside me. It was the nicest thing I owned, the one piece of clothing that made me feel like I might be someone worth knowing. The party raged on around me, a kaleidoscope of faces I recognized from lecture halls and campus coffee shops, but had never really spoken to. They seemed to inhabit their bodies differently than I inhabited mine, moving with a confidence that felt foreign to me. I watched them the way I might watch a nature documentary, trying to decode the social rhythms that came so naturally to everyone else. I was contemplating my escape route when the kitchen door swung open and someone stumbled out, laughing in a way that cut through the ambient noise like a knife through silk. He was tall, lean in a way that suggested he forgot to eat rather than chose not to, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in waves that looked effortlessly messy. His shirt, a faded band tee I didn't recognize, was damp across the front, and he was still laughing at something someone had said in the kitchen, his head thrown back like he had never learned to be embarrassed about taking up space. He stopped in the doorway, surveying the crowded living room, and I watched him shiver. The dampness of his shirt must have been making him cold. His eyes swept across the room, past the clusters of people dancing badly to music that was too loud, past the couple making out against the far wall, past me. Then they swept back. His gaze landed on my jacket, draped over the chair beside me, like a patient animal waiting for its owner. Without hesitation, without asking, he crossed the room and slipped it on. The gesture was so casual, so presumptuous, that for a moment I could only stare. The jacket fit him differently than it fit me, looser in the shoulders, the sleeves hitting him just above his wrists where they came down to my knuckles. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, not through me or around me the way most people did. His eyes were darker than I had first thought, brown with flecks of something lighter, and they held mine for a beat longer than politeness required. In that moment, something shifted in my chest, a recognition I couldn't name but felt in my bones. He smiled, not the performative smile people wear at parties, but something smaller and more genuine. Then he nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to be both an apology and a challenge, and melted back into the crowd. I watched him go, my jacket moving with him like a second skin, and felt something I had never experienced before. The strange thrill of being seen and the even stranger thrill of being taken from. I spent the rest of the night hyper-aware of glimpses of charcoal, wool moving through the party. A flash of the jacket's familiar silhouette as he leaned against a doorframe, talking to someone I didn't know. The sight of him on the back porch, my jacket collar turned up against the October chill, gesturing animatedly with his hands as he told some story that made the small group around him lean in closer. Each sighting sent a jolt of something through me. Not quite anger, not quite excitement, but something that lived in the space between the two. I kept thinking I should approach him, ask for the jacket back. It was mine after all. But every time I worked up the courage to move, he would disappear again, absorbed into a conversation or a group, or simply the general chaos of the party. And if I was being honest with myself, which was something I tried to avoid at the best of times, I wasn't sure I wanted it back. Not yet. There was something intoxicating about watching him wear it, about seeing this piece of myself existing in the world on someone else's body. The jacket looked different on him, less careful, less contained. On me, it was armor. On him, it was just clothing. The difference felt significant in a way I couldn't articulate. As the night wore on and the party began to thin, I found myself still pressed against that same wall, still nursing the same drink that had gone warm and flat in my hand. Maya found me there around midnight, slightly drunk and thoroughly annoyed that I hadn't mingled more. She said goodbye, kissed my cheek with breath that smelled like wine, and reminded me that life was for living. I nodded and agreed, and watched her leave with a group of people whose names I had never bothered to learn. I stayed until the very end, until the music stopped, and someone turned on the harsh overhead lights that revealed all the party secrets, spilled drinks and abandoned cups, forgotten phone chargers, and inside-out clothing that told stories I didn't want to imagine. I stayed until the house had mostly emptied out and the jacket was nowhere to be seen. Walking home through the quiet streets, my arms wrapped around myself against the cold, I realized I didn't know his name. I didn't know what he studied, or where he lived, or whether he would remember me tomorrow. All I knew was that somewhere in this small college town, a stranger was wearing the only thing that had ever made me feel like I belonged to something larger than myself. The thought should have made me angry. Instead, it made me feel alive in a way I hadn't experienced in years. By the time I reached my apartment, I had made a decision. I wouldn't go looking for him or the jacket. But if I saw him again, when I saw him again, I would finally work up the courage to speak. After all, he had something of mine. And for reasons I was just beginning to understand, I was in no hurry to get it back. The days after the party settled into their familiar rhythm, but something had shifted in the quality of the ordinary. I woke each morning in my narrow single bed, light filtering through curtains I had hung with mathematical precision, and felt the absence of the jacket like a phantom limb. The empty hanger in my closet seemed to mock me, a metal skeleton where something vital used to live. My apartment was a study in careful restraint. Books lined the walls in alphabetical order by author, their spines creating neat rows of muted colors. Burgundy philosophy texts, cream-colored poetry collections, the occasional novel that had survived my periodic purges of anything too sentimental. A small turntable sat on a wooden crate in the corner, surrounded by vinyl records I had collected but rarely played, as if the act of listening might disturb some invisible balance I had worked years to achieve. I had chosen this place specifically for its distance from campus chaos, a converted studio above a used bookstore where the landlord was old enough not to care what I did as long as the rent arrived on time. The walls were painted in institutional beige that I had never bothered to change, and a single window looked out onto a tree that marked the seasons for me better than any calendar. Now, in mid-October, its leaves had turned the color of rust and amber, a beauty that felt almost aggressive in its insistence on being noticed. My routine had become its own form of armor. Monday through Friday, I attended lectures where I sat in the same seat in the back row, taking notes in handwriting so neat it could have been printed. I participated just enough to avoid drawing attention, answer questions with the kind of careful precision that made professors nod approvingly and then forget my name. Between classes, I worked at the university library, shelving returns, and helping undergraduates find books they would skim rather than read. The library was my sanctuary. In the stacks, between towering shelves that smelled of aging paper and quiet desperation, I could move unseen through cathedral spaces built for contemplation. I knew every section by heart, could navigate the Dewey Decimal System like a native language. Students would approach my desk with whispered requests, and I would guide them to their destinations with the efficiency of someone who had mapped every corner of this particular universe. But even in my carefully constructed solitude, word of him began to reach me. Adrian. I learned his name from overhearing conversations I pretended not to listen to. Adrian, who was studying photography and could be found at all hours in the darkroom in the basement of the arts building. Adrian, who had once convinced 3 strangers to pose for a series of portraits on the quad at sunrise, who collected vintage cameras the way other people collected regrets, who moved through social circles like water finding its level. I began to notice things I had trained myself to ignore. The way other students talked about him with a mixture of envy and affection, as if proximity to him might transfer some of his easiness with the world. How his name came up in conversations about parties I hadn't attended, art shows I hadn't seen, late-night adventures that sounded both reckless and enviable. From these scattered pieces of information, I constructed an image of someone whose life existed in full color, while mine remained stubbornly monochrome. He was the kind of person who made friends accidentally, who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with dinner invitations. Everything I heard about him suggested a fundamental comfort with unpredictability that felt as foreign to me as a language I had never learned. Meanwhile, autumn deepened around the campus. The trees that lined the quad burst into flames of red and gold, and students began layering sweaters under their coats. I watched them from library windows, these young people who seemed to know instinctively how to be young, how to waste time in ways that didn't feel like failure. They gathered in groups on the grass, their laughter carrying on air that was becoming sharp with the promise of winter. I had friends, or what passed for friends in my carefully managed life. Maya, who had dragged me to the party, called occasionally to check on me with the persistence of someone who had appointed herself my social conscience. There were study partners from my philosophy seminars, classmates who knew me well enough to exchange pleasantries, but not well enough to ask why I always seemed to be holding something back. But friendship required a kind of emotional availability that I had never quite mastered. I could discuss Kierkegaard's anxiety and Sartre's bad faith with academic precision, but when conversation turned to more immediate concerns, fears about the future, family complications, the simple loneliness of being 22 and uncertain, I found myself retreating behind analysis, turning genuine feeling into intellectual exercise. The jacket's absence became a constant reminder of that night, of the moment when someone had seen me clearly enough to take something that belonged to me. I replayed the encounter obsessively, analyzing each detail like a text I was trying to decode. The casual confidence of his gesture, the way he had looked at me as if I might be worth looking at, the smile that suggested he knew something about me that I didn't know about myself. As October wore on and the first frost painted the windows of my apartment with delicate patterns, I realized I was waiting. Not actively searching. That would have required an initiative I wasn't ready to claim, but waiting with the kind of alert patience of someone listening for a sound they couldn't quite identify. Every time I walked across campus, every time I shelved books in the library stacks, every time I sat in my usual seat at the back of lecture halls, part of me was scanning for a familiar silhouette wearing something that had once been mine. The waiting had a weight to it, a significance that I was only beginning to understand. It wasn't just about the jacket anymore, if it ever had been. It was about the possibility that someone might have seen something in me worth stealing, worth keeping, worth remembering on cold October nights when the world felt larger and lonelier than it had any right to be. I saw him first through the window of the campus cafe, a figure hunched over a small table near the back, surrounded by what looked like half the contents of a camera bag. Even from across the street, even through glass that reflected the gray November sky, I recognized the line of his shoulders beneath the familiar charcoal wool. My jacket, weathered now from weeks of wear, softened at the edges in ways I had never allowed it to become on my own body. For a moment, I stood frozen on the sidewalk, students flowing around me like water around stone. The rational part of my mind cataloged excuses. I was late for my shift at the library. I had papers to grade. I should give him space to work. But there was something in the way he sat, utterly absorbed in whatever he was examining through a jeweler's loupe, that made the excuses feel thin and cowardly. I pushed through the cafe's heavy door, immediately enveloped by the smell of espresso and the low murmur of academic conversations. The space was crowded with the usual afternoon population, graduate students nursing single cups of coffee over thick textbooks, undergraduates typing furiously on laptops with screens full of half-finished essays, professors grading papers with a weary expression of people who had read the same arguments too many times. He looked up as I approached, as if some shift in the air had announced my presence. Up close, I could see that his hair was longer than it had been at the party, curling slightly at the ends in a way that suggested he had forgotten to get it cut, rather than chosen the length deliberately. There were shadows under his eyes that spoke of late nights in dark rooms, and his fingers were stained with the faint chemical residue that marked serious photographers. "I was hoping I'd run into you," he said, and his voice carried the same easy warmth I remembered from that night weeks ago. The words hit me with unexpected force, not just their content, but the casual way he delivered them, as if running into me had been a pleasant inevitability rather than the chance encounter it was. He gestured to the chair across from him, and I found myself sitting before I had consciously decided to stay. The table between us was scattered with contact sheets and strips of negatives, images I couldn't quite make sense of from my angle, but that seemed to capture moments of ordinary life rendered extraordinary through his lens. A woman laughing on a park bench, her mouth open in mid-joy. An elderly man feeding pigeons, the birds frozen in mid-flight around his outstretched hands. Fragments of humanity caught in silver and shadow. "I meant to return it," he said, tugging at the collar of my jacket with a gesture that was both apologetic and oddly possessive. But somehow I kept finding reasons not to. He paused, studying my face as if trying to read something written there in a language he was still learning. "It feels like it belongs here now," he said quietly, like it was always meant to be worn by someone who actually goes places. The observation stung because it was true. I had bought the jacket to be the kind of person who went places, who moved through the world with purpose and destination. Instead, I had worn it like armor, a barrier between myself and experiences that might leave marks, might change the careful shape I had given my life. He insisted on buying me coffee as repayment for his theft, though we both seemed to understand it was an inadequate exchange. As he stood in line, I studied the photographs spread across the table, trying to understand how he saw the world. There was an intimacy to the images that had nothing to do with their subjects and everything to do with the patience required to wait for the perfect moment, the willingness to see beauty in the mundane. When he returned with 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the afternoon light filtering through the cafe windows, our conversation began tentatively, the way most meaningful exchanges do, with small questions that opened into larger territories. He asked about the books I was reading, listened with genuine curiosity as I tried to explain Heidegger's concept of being in the world. I found myself talking more than I usually did, encouraged by the way he leaned forward when I spoke, the way his attention felt like a physical weight. In return, he told me about photography, about the magic of watching images emerge in developer solution, the way a photograph could capture not just what something looked like, but how it felt to be there in that moment. He spoke about light the way other people talked about music, as if it had rhythm and texture and emotional significance. His passion made him more animated, his hands moving as he described the perfect quality of winter sunlight, the way shadows fell differently in the early morning hours when most people were still asleep. The afternoon stretched longer than either of us had planned. Other students came and went, laptops closed and books packed away, but we remained at our small table as the light outside grew slanted and golden. The conversation meandered through territories I hadn't explored with another person in years. Childhood fears, family disappointments, the strange loneliness of being surrounded by people who knew your name but not the shape of your thoughts. When we finally gathered our things to leave, the sky outside had deepened to the particular blue that arrives just before darkness. He walked with me toward the library, our pace unconsciously slow, as if neither of us wanted to reach the point where we would have to say goodbye and go our separate ways. At the library steps, he paused, one hand still absently fingering the collar of my jacket. "You know," he said, "I don't actually want to give this back." The honesty in his voice was startling, unguarded in a way that made something flutter in my chest. And maybe that was the moment I began to understand that this wasn't really about the jacket at all, had never been about the jacket. It was about the permission to want something, to let myself be wanted in return. What followed was a gradual dissolution of the boundaries I had spent years constructing around myself. Our meetings began to feel less accidental and more inevitable, as if some invisible thread was drawing us together despite our different orbits around campus life. He would appear at the library during my evening shifts, not to study but to wait for me to finish, perched on one of the uncomfortable wooden chairs near the circulation desk with a book he never seemed to actually read. The first time he suggested we walk instead of parting ways at the library entrance, November had turned bitter, the kind of cold that made your breath visible and your fingers ache inside inadequate gloves. But I found myself nodding, following him through streets I had walked countless times but had never really seen. With him beside me, the familiar geography of our small college town revealed hidden corners and unexpected beauty. A narrow alley where someone had painted a mural of birds in flight, a garden behind the old Presbyterian church where late-blooming roses still clung to their thorny stems. He had a way of noticing things that would have remained invisible to me walking alone. The way frost formed different patterns on north-facing windows versus south-facing ones. The sound our footsteps made on different types of pavement, sharp on concrete, muffled on fallen leaves, hollow on the wooden bridges that crossed the creek running through campus. He photographed some of these details, but more often he simply pointed them out, teaching me to see the world through eyes that looked for composition and meaning in the mundane. Our conversations during these walks began to shed the careful politeness of acquaintanceship. He told me about growing up in a house where his parents spoke to each other primarily through him, using their only child as a translator for emotions they couldn't express directly. I found myself talking about my grandmother, the woman who had given me the jacket, whose death the previous winter had left me feeling unmoored in ways I was still discovering. One evening, as we climbed the fire escape of the old humanities building to reach the roof he had discovered during his first week on campus, he asked me about the philosophy books that seemed to follow me everywhere. I tried to explain how certain ideas had become essential to my understanding of existence. Kierkegaard's leap of faith, Sartre's radical freedom, Camus' absurd rebellion against meaninglessness. But up there, with the lights of the town spread below us like a constellation fallen to earth, academic concepts felt inadequate to describe the sensation of standing beside someone who made the night seem less vast and threatening. He showed me photographs on these rooftop visits, images he had been working on in the darkroom that occupied most of his free time. They were portraits of strangers, mostly people he had approached on the street or in coffee shops, asking permission to capture something he saw in their faces. There was a tenderness to the images that spoke of genuine connection, brief but authentic encounters with people who had trusted him enough to be seen clearly. I admired his ability to approach strangers, to create intimacy in the space of conversation. It was a skill that felt as foreign to me as speaking a different language. When I told him this, he studied my face in the dim light reflected from the street lamps below and said that some people were worth the patience it took to know them slowly. The comment lodged itself somewhere in my chest, a warmth that stayed with me long after we had climbed back down to street level. The library stacks became another shared territory. During quiet afternoon hours when few students ventured into the deeper sections, he would find me shelving returns or processing new acquisitions. He moved through the narrow aisles with the same careful attention he brought to photography, running his fingers along book spines as if reading their histories through touch. I began to see the space differently through his presence, not just as a repository of knowledge, but as a kind of cathedral where thoughts and dreams had been preserved between covers. He was curious about everything I was reading, asking questions that pushed me to articulate ideas I had previously only explored in solitude. When I tried to explain Heidegger's concept of thrownness, the idea that we find ourselves existing without having chosen to exist, he nodded with the kind of understanding that suggested the concept resonated with his own experience of moving through the world. In return, he began to share the more technical aspects of his work, explaining how different films responded to light, how the chemistry of development could be manipulated to create specific moods and effects. He talked about photography as a form of time travel, each image a moment rescued from the flow of experience and made permanent. There was poetry in his technical knowledge, a recognition that art happened in the intersection between craft and vision. As December approached, and our evening walks required heavier coats and warmer gloves, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in how I moved through my days. The careful routines that had once defined my existence now felt like scaffolding around something more substantial and surprising. I found myself looking forward to our meetings with an anticipation that was both thrilling and terrifying. The jacket, still draped around his shoulders during these cold nights, had become such a natural part of his appearance that I sometimes forgot it had ever belonged to me. Seeing him where it no longer felt like theft, but like transformation, as if the garment had found its way to where it was meant to be, warming someone who was teaching me what it might mean to be warm in return. The rain started as we were walking back from the coffee shop where we had spent the entire afternoon, our conversation stretching like taffy until the barista had begun stacking chairs with pointed efficiency. December rain in our small college town was a particular form of misery, cold enough to numb exposed skin, but not cold enough to become the clean simplicity of snow. By the time we reached Adrian's building, both of us were soaked despite our hurried pace, water dripping from our hair and the edges of clothing that had proven inadequate against the sudden downpour. His apartment was on the third floor of a converted Victorian house that had been carved into student housing with the kind of creative geometry that prioritized maximum occupancy over livability. The stairs creaked under our wet shoes, and I followed him up through a narrow hallway that smelled of old wood and the accumulated cooking experiments of a dozen different tenants. His door opened onto a space that was smaller than my own, but somehow felt more alive. Where my apartment was all careful restraint and neutral colors, his was chaos with purpose. Photographs covered every available wall surface, not framed and matted like a gallery, but pinned and taped in overlapping layers that created a visual diary of his time here. Contact sheets were scattered across a desk, made from sawhorses and a sheet of plywood. Empty film canisters served as pencil holders. A enlarger occupied one corner like a mechanical prayer wheel, surrounded by trays and bottles of chemicals that gave the air a sharp, medicinal scent. And there, draped over the back of a wooden chair that had probably been salvaged from a thrift store, was my jacket. Seeing it in this context, surrounded by his life, softened by months of wear, made something shift inside my chest. It looked different here, less like my possession and more like a garment that had found its way home. We stood, dripping on his threshold, suddenly aware of our proximity in the small space, the way our wet clothes clung to our bodies and made us more present to each other than we had ever been before. He moved first, going to find towels, and I was left alone with his photographs, finally able to study them closely in better light than our evening walks had provided. The images revealed a different side of him than the easy charm he showed the world. These were photographs that required patience and vulnerability. Portraits of elderly people sitting on park benches, children playing games whose rules seemed to exist only in their own imaginations, couples arguing on street corners with the kind of intensity that suggested decades of shared history. Each image captured something essential about its subject, some truth that existed beneath the surface of ordinary moments. When he returned with towels and offered me dry clothes, a sweater that would be too big, sweatpants that I would have to roll at the cuffs, the gesture felt weighted with significance beyond simple practicality. I accepted, and we moved around each other in the small space with a new awareness. The domestic intimacy of drying hair and changing into borrowed clothes, creating a different kind of vulnerability than any conversation had achieved. We sat on his narrow bed because it was the only seating that allowed us both to face each other comfortably, backs against opposite walls, legs stretched out with careful attention to maintaining appropriate distance. The rain continued against his single window, creating a rhythm that seemed to encourage confidences. "I've been waiting for you to ask for it back," he said suddenly, nodding toward the jacket. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. His voice was quieter than usual, almost breaking on the edges of the admission. I looked at him across the small distance that separated us. Taking in away his hair had dried in unruly waves, the way my borrowed sweater hung on his frame, the nervous energy in his hands as he picked at a loose thread in the blanket beneath us. "You don't really want it, do you?" The question was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile thing was building in the space between us. The honesty in his voice demanded honesty in return, and I found myself speaking words I hadn't known I was ready to say. "No," I said, and the admission felt like stepping off a cliff. "I don't want it back. I want you to keep it." The distance between us collapsed thin, not dramatically, but inevitably, like a held breath finally released. He leaned forward, and I met him halfway, and when our lips touched, it was with the tentative wonder of people who had been waiting for permission to want what they wanted. The kiss was hesitant at first, questioning, but when I didn't pull away, it deepened into something that felt like recognition. This was what I had been afraid to name during all those evening walks, all those conversations that had stretched longer than they needed to. This hunger for connection that I'd spent years trying to rationalize away or sublimate into academic pursuits. When we finally separated, our foreheads touching, breath mingling in the small space between us, I understood that the jacket had never been about fabric or warmth. It had been a placeholder for this, the possibility of being wanted by someone I wanted in return, the terrifying and exhilarating prospect of being known not just intellectually but completely. Relief flooded through me, tangled with fear so intense it made my hands shake. I had spent so long constructing careful barriers around myself, so long believing that safety lay in remaining unknown, that this sudden exposure felt like being turned inside out. But as we sat there in the dim light of his small apartment, rain still drumming against the window, I realized that all my careful defenses had been preparation for this moment when I would finally have something worth protecting. The days that followed existed in a strange suspension between revelation and retreat. I found myself caught in a loop of memory, replaying the weight of Adrian's mouth against mine, the way his fingers had tangled in my hair, the particular quality of silence that had settled over his small apartment when we finally pulled apart. But alongside the memory came a familiar companion, the urge to analyze, to categorize, to reduce the moment to something manageable and safe. I could have called it an aberration, a moment of weakness brought on by proximity and rain and the strange intimacy of borrowed clothes. I could have retreated to the comfortable distance of intellectual friendship, pretended that the kiss had been a mistake we were both too mature to repeat. The option felt simultaneously rational and cowardly, a return to the carefully controlled existence I'd spent years perfecting. Instead, I found myself avoiding him entirely. For 3 days, I altered my routes across campus to minimize the chance of accidental encounters. I worked different shifts at the library, took my meals at odd hours, studied in corners of the building where he was unlikely to find me. It was a particular form of torture, this self-imposed exile, made worse by the knowledge that I was choosing it. On the 4th day, he found me anyway. I was shelving books in the poetry section, deep enough in the stacks that most students never ventured there, when I heard footsteps on the industrial carpet behind me. I knew it was him before I turned around, recognized something in the rhythm of his approach that was both tentative and determined. "We need to talk," he said, and his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. Gone was the easy confidence that had characterized all our previous interactions. Instead, he sounded tired, uncertain, almost fragile. I followed him to a study room tucked away on the 4th floor, a space hardly bigger than a closet with a single window that looked out onto the quad, where December wind was stripping the last leaves from the oak trees. We sat across from each other at a table scarred with years of student anxiety, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. "I don't want to be just another fleeting connection," he said finally. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I've had enough of those to know they don't mean anything in the end. His admission caught me off guard, this glimpse of vulnerability from someone who had always seemed effortlessly at ease with the world. I had assumed that his social fluidity meant he moved through relationships with the same casual confidence he brought to everything else. The idea that he might be as afraid of impermanence as I was had never occurred to me. I could have done nothing, he continued, watching my face for some sign of how his words were landing. I could have returned the jacket weeks ago, and we could have been strangers passing each other on campus. But I kept it because I wanted an excuse to see you again. because something about you made me want to know what you were thinking about when you got that look on your face during our conversations. The honesty in his voice was almost unbearable. It stripped away all the careful defenses I had been constructing since that evening in his apartment, left me sitting across from him with nowhere to hide from the intensity of his attention. "I'm scared," I said, and the admission felt like stepping out of a warm building into winter air. I've never known how to do this, how to be with someone without losing myself completely. The fear was real and immediate, a recognition that letting someone this close meant risking the careful equilibrium I had spent years achieving. I had watched other people navigate relationships with what seemed like natural ease, but for me the prospect felt like learning a new language without a dictionary, all instinct and guesswork, and the constant possibility of catastrophic misunderstanding. "You don't have to lose yourself," he said quietly. "You just have to trust that there's room for both of us in whatever this becomes." The simplicity of the statement belied its complexity. Trust had never come easily to me, especially the kind of trust that required believing someone would stay even after seeing all the careful mechanisms I used to keep the world at a manageable distance. But sitting there in that small room, with winter light falling across his face and highlighting the genuine concern in his eyes, I felt something shift in my chest. "Keep the jacket," I said, and the words came out steadier than I had expected. Not as something borrowed, but as something that belongs to you now. It was a small gesture that carried the weight of everything I couldn't yet say directly, that I wanted to try, that I was willing to risk the safety of solitude for the possibility of connection, that whatever was building between us deserved more than my fear. He smiled then, the first genuine smile I had seen from him since that night in his apartment, and reached across the table to take my hand. His fingers were warm, slightly stained with developer chemicals, real and present in a way that made all my careful abstractions feel suddenly irrelevant. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and the promise settled something in me that I hadn't even known was unsettled. "This doesn't have to be perfect or figure out completely. It just has to be honest." As we left the library together, walking out into the sharp December afternoon, I realized that I was making a choice I had been avoiding my entire adult life. The choice to be present instead of protected, to risk disappointment in exchange for the possibility of joy. Winter arrived with the kind of deliberate authority that transformed our small college town into something from a different century. Snow fell in thick, persistent curtains that muffled sound and softened the harsh angles of institutional architecture. The quad became a blank canvas where footprints told stories of late-night library sessions and early morning classes, paths worn by students who moved through the cold with purpose and determination. I had learned to navigate this landscape differently than I had navigated previous winters, where once I might have hurried between heated buildings with my head down, focused only on reaching my next destination. I now found myself noticing the way morning light caught ice crystals on bare tree branches, the particular quality of silence that snow brought to familiar spaces. Adrian's way of seeing had become part of my own vision, as if his attention to beauty had been contagious. We had fallen into rhythms that felt both new and ancient. Evening walks that began at the library and ended wherever our conversation took us, sometimes lasting until the streetlights created pools of warmth in the crystalline air. Saturday mornings in his darkroom, where I learned to read contact sheets and understand the subtle alchemy of light and shadow. Sunday afternoons in my apartment, where he would spread his photographs across my carefully organized desk while I read passages aloud from books that had shaped my understanding of existence. The intimacy between us had developed with the same gradual inevitability as the changing seasons. There had been no dramatic declarations, no moments of overwhelming passion that swept away uncertainty in their wake. Instead, there had been a series of small recognitions. The way he reached for my hand while we walked, how naturally I had begun to curl against his warmth when we fell asleep together, the ease with which we had learned to share space and silence, and the particular vulnerability of morning conversations before the day imposed its demands. The jacket had become such a natural part of his appearance that I sometimes forgot it had ever belonged to me. seeing him where it no longer carried the strange thrill of recognition it once had. Instead, it simply looked right, the way certain combinations of color and texture seem inevitable once you've seen them together. He wore it to class, to his job at the campus photography center, on our evening walks when the temperature dropped below freezing and breath became visible in the air between us. But that morning in February, as I walked across campus toward my first class of the day, I spotted him in the distance and felt that familiar flutter of recognition that had never quite faded. He was standing near the fountain that had been turned off for the winter, camera raised to capture something I couldn't see from my angle. The jacket, my jacket, his jacket now, was draped around his shoulders, dark against the white backdrop of new snow. He must have sensed my approach, because he turned before I reached him, lowering his camera with the kind of smile that had become as familiar as my own reflection. We had passed beyond the need for elaborate greetings, the careful negotiations of early relationship. Instead, we simply moved toward each other with the gravitational pull of bodies that had learned to exist in the same orbit. "What were you photographing?" I asked, and he showed me the back of his camera where a digital preview revealed an image of frost patterns on the fountain stone basin, intricate as lace and temporary as breath on glass. "I wanted to capture how beautiful ordinary things become when the light hits them right," he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he was talking about more than just the intersection of winter morning and carved stone. We stood there for a moment, two figures in the landscape of our shared life, and I felt the weight of everything that had brought us to this point. The party where he had first taken my jacket, the weeks of careful conversation that had preceded recognition, the evening in his apartment, when we had finally acknowledged what was building between us. All of it had led to this unremarkable moment on an ordinary Tuesday morning when being together had become as natural as breathing. "I should get to class," I said, but made no move to leave. The professor whose lecture on existentialism I had been hurrying to attend suddenly seemed less urgent than this moment of connection, this brief pause in the rhythm of our days when we could simply exist together without agenda or destination. "I'll see you tonight," he said, and it wasn't a question but a statement of fact, a recognition that our days now had structure around each other, that my evening would naturally include his presence the way it included dinner and reading and the gradual settling into sleep. As I finally turned to walk toward the philosophy building, I realized that somewhere in the months between autumn and winter, between taking and keeping, between fear and trust, I had learned to exhale completely. The cold air filled my lungs with a cleanness that felt like possibility, and for once I wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might demand of me. I had found something worth keeping, something worth the risk of being kept in return. The jacket, wherever it was in that moment, had fulfilled its purpose in ways I could never have imagined when I first hung it carefully in my closet. It had become the thread that connected two lives, the tangible symbol of all the invisible bonds that make love possible. Trust and patience, and the willingness to be changed by proximity to another person's way of being in the world.